Last summer I had the opportunity to test the Canon RF 800mm f11 lens, and when it came out it was quite groundbreaking because it was the first super telephoto lens that came in such a small and cheap package. So I was quite excited about it. On the other hand, me and many other people were also a bit concerned about things of the lens. First, how sharp is it really for this cheap price? And the second, maybe even more important question, is f11 usable? Is it too dark? Is the background too distracting? And I was using the lens for quite a while. I did some tests. I compared it in the real world outside against my 600mm f4 with a tele extender. So I think I got some results both for sharpness and for background rendering, and this is what I want to share in this video with you today. Since I had to return the lens, I'm not holding it at my hands at the moment, but I still want to talk a bit about the specs and the handling. And the first thing you realize when you buy this lens is, of course, it's not breaking your account, hopefully. It comes at $900 or even slightly below, and it's also not very heavy. It weighs around 1,260 grams, which translates to 2.77 pounds. And for an 800mm lens, this is really quite lightweight. Even though I need to say it is still quite a large lens, not in diameter. It comes with a 95mm filter thread. So for those of you that want to put filters on it, this should also be reasonable. But the length is rather big, so it's around 35 centimeters, which is almost 14 inches long. And this is in, let's say, the compact form. Because one special thing about this lens, and also the smaller brother, the 600mm f11, is that you actually need to unlock and open the lens before you can use it on the camera. And you need to lock it again before you mount it on the camera. This, of course, makes it a bit easier for transport because it's smaller. On the other hand, I need to say I found it in the beginning quite annoying, and afterwards I got a bit used to it, but it is something that could cause you to miss shots in some situations. The lens also has some other switches, of course the AF/MF switch, then it has a focus limiter, so either the full extent or a 20 meter to infinity. And since we speak about the focal distance that you have, actually the near focal distance is 6 meters, which is really not so close. So this means the maximum magnification that you can get is around 0.14, which is not a lot, but I will come a bit more into this later. And just to mention the last switch, it's an IS on-off switch, so you don't have different image stabilizer modes, but you have an image stabilizer that you can turn on and off. And I think for a lens at this price point, this is really enough. On the other hand, I think not including a lens hood, this is something I don't understand from Canon, and I think this is not really good. Such a lens hood made out of plastic is really not so expensive, and I think this should come with every telephoto lens. Let's move to the autofocus. How did it perform there? Well, it was quite fast in my experience, so moving the focus from close to infinity and so was all fine. One thing which is important to note is that because it's an f11 lens, there's not so much light entering to the camera, so you don't have the autofocus areas all over the picture, but rather a bit more in the center. It's not ideal, but it's also not the end of the world. I need to say, we're a bit spoiled with mirrorless cameras now, but with DSLRs we always had the constraint, so this is not the biggest issue. I had more the problem with this lens that it was somehow not sticking properly to the subject, and I don't mean the tracking itself, I just mean I was trying to take pictures of a blackbird, of a finch, whatever, that was not really moving, and still the focus didn't really lock on the bird. Maybe this is the better word. It was hunting a bit back and forth, not dramatically, but I would say if I took 5 shots of a not really moving bird, I would say maybe only 2 were really sharp, the others were just slightly off. And I always keep my camera in the servo AF because the bird can still move a bit and the camera should adjust for this. And this is just the only lens that I used on my R5 that had this issue. The RF 100-400, 100-500 or my old EF lenses did not show this problem. As I said before, the lens also comes with an image stabilizer, and this was actually the first RF lens I was ever using with my Canon R5, and I was quite amazed of how smooth the picture is once you look through the viewfinder and the image stabilizer kicks in. This was just no comparison to my 600mm f4, which is still an EF lens. So let's get to the really important point of image quality. How was it? Well, generally I would say quite good. It exceeded my expectations. The pictures were quite sharp. You can see here a comparison that I did with the 800mm f11 and with the 600mm f4 with a teleconverter attached. And I think the 800mm is holding up quite well, even though we need to see there is clearly an edge on the 600mm f4, which is, I think, totally fair for if you look at the difference in the price point. But just to say, the RF 100-400 and RF 100-500, they were both delivering a bit sharper results than this RF 800mm f11 lens. I was really skeptical about this f11 aperture in the beginning. It's also a fixed aperture, meaning you cannot stop down more even if you wanted to. So it's really f11, but honestly I was never in a situation where I wanted to stop down more. Maybe if you do some panning shots and it's quite bright outside, you might want to do this, but usually I was quite fine with this f11. I would have rather wished to have more light, because with f11, even if it's not so dark outside, the ISOs start to climb up quite easily, so that's maybe not ideal. But also, to be honest, with an R6, R5, this is not so much of a deal. What I was more concerned about was the rendering of the background. Would it be smooth enough or not? And again here, as a comparison with my 600mm f4, so you can see there is of course a huge difference. But the question was not, is there a difference? The question was, is f11 good enough? And here the answer is a clear, it depends. So if you can arrange yourself a bit, maybe move and more or less select the background, like have some distant mountains in the background, or maybe you're at the bird feeder or you're shooting birds on a lake and in the water, then usually actually with 800mm I found f11 can be quite nice. Maybe you see a bit more structure in the background, but not really disturbing. But in other situations where I'm just more walking around, just looking for birds, there I found f11 sometimes quite limiting. And I also need to say, I realized it more in the rendering of the foreground than the background. So sometimes I like to shoot through some leaves or branches to have like a nice blurry foreground to like add another layer in the picture. And this was something that I found is just not really possible with the 800mm f11. At least the way I was doing this never looked good. So yeah, if you really look into this type of shooting, I think you might be disappointed with the lens. But it clearly has some other benefits, and the f11 was not always an issue. So what are my conclusions? I think if you're a beginner photographer and you want to take pictures of small birds or birds that are quite far away, you don't want a super heavy lens. It's still a bit large, but it's not heavy, and you want a cheap option. Honestly, I think the 800mm f11 is the best choice you have. If on the other hand you're more shooting in local parks, also have maybe some swans, geese, ducks that are a bit closer, and sometimes you find 800mm is too much, or on the other hand, if you shoot songbirds on a close distance, you might find that 6mm of minimum focal distance is just not really usable, or maybe you also want to do some macro shots of dragonflies, amphibians. Then I think the 800mm might not be the ideal lens for you. Then I would go rather for the RF 100-400. Of course, you have way less focal length, but you have the flexibility of a zoom, you have even better image quality, from my experience, better autofocus, and the lens is significantly more compact, and yeah, regarding the price point, it's even a bit cheaper. So this might be an option for you. And if you cannot decide whether you want a long but fixed lens or rather a bit a shorter one but one that offers more flexibility, there is a solution for you, at least if you are willing to spend a bit more money and carry a tiny bit more weight. and this would be the Canon RF 100 to 500mm. I made a review. I will link both this review and the one to the RF 100 to 400 in the video description or in the comments below. And the 100 to 500 for me is just somehow combining both. If you like put an 1.4 extender on the 100 to 500, you get to 700mm with an F10. This is quite close to the 800 F11. On the other hand, without the extender, you can start at 100mm, zooming all the way through to 500. So yeah, you get the flexibility of the zoom, you get the focal length of the 800mm. As I said, the main downside is just that it costs way more at around $3,000 US. But if you have the money, this is still an option which is not too heavy, because if you really care a lot about the background, then there is of course always the option of an 800mm f5.6 or let's say a 600mm f4. But I think none of you is really is really wondering, should I get a lens for $14,000 or even $18,000 or one for $900? So these are just two completely different lenses. And this is maybe an additional comment, and it's more something I wish from Canon, something in between. Let's stick to the 800mm lenses. There we have the 800mm f5.6, which, if I recall correctly, is around $16,000 to $18,000 US. It's quite lightweight for its class, but it's still, again, correct me if I'm wrong, around 3 kilograms heavy. And on the other hand, we have the 800mm f11, which is light, compact, quite inexpensive, but the f11 is a bit limiting. So I'm just wondering, isn't there like something in between? Isn't there space for something in between, like an 800mm f8, or if we go a step down, 600mm f5.6 instead of the 600mm f4 and the 600mm f11? So yeah, this is just some final thoughts I have. I hope you liked the video. I hope it helped you a bit. Again, if you're not sure about which of these rather inexpensive RF lenses to buy, check out the other videos, and please leave a subscription to the channel, activate the notifications. It would really help me a lot and mean a lot to me, and see you in the next video. Bye.